gravity's pushing me straight down, where's the easiest place for me to bend at? It's this hip. So my hip wants to kick out that way. What muscle doesn't let it happen? The hip abductors, glute medius, which it contracts and it maintains this vertical position. So every time my foot comes off the ground, this little hip abductor has to turn on, and then it has to turn off. Does it create that? No, what it creates is this. Not a whole lot to see. But what it prevents is that from happening. It's not a strong muscle, but it has to turn on, it has to turn off at the exact right time. It has to be fast, it has to be quick, and it has to be responsive. But what do we do to train it? Somebody has a glute medius problem. How do we train the glute medius? We do clamshells. We lay on our side and we do resisted hip abduction. Now, I'm not bashing the exercise. I'm bashing the people that use the exercise. Because if I say, why are you doing that? There is a correct answer for it. I've never gotten the correct answer, but there is a correct answer for it. Oftentimes, when you ask people why I'm doing it, I want to strengthen the glute medius. Well, you're trying to strengthen a muscle that is all about control. Okay, that's smart. That's completely the wrong answer. Because it's not about strength, it's about speed. We have to be able to quickly turn that muscle on and turn that muscle off. That's how a stabilizer works. So all of our methods to strengthen the glute medius are clamshells. We can put another good one is we'll get down in half knee and we put a band around the knee and we really work to get that knee to drive out. Or we'll put the band around the knee when we do stuff here so that we get a lot of burning and fatigue in that glute medius. Is it an endurance muscle or is it a speed muscle? It's a speed muscle. On and off. Not on and stay on and constantly stay on, because if this is your gait cycle, you're not going to get anywhere. That's how stabilizers work. They have to turn on and they have to turn on very, very quickly. So when we talk about these muscles, they're very fast. They're so closely tied into our visual system that we don't even perceive the changes happening. Part 3 of the semester, when we talk about the fascial lines, we're going to come back and talk about this a lot. Because the importance of this very small region right here and what it does for the fascial lines and how that affects the rest of the body is critical for when we start making our decisions about how we're going to go after things from a rehab standpoint. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you did anything that involved the neck from a rehab standpoint? Recently? Not too likely? Okay. So in the last week, is it safe to say nobody's done anything with a neck in the last week? Safe to say that? Okay. Have you dealt with a shoulder in the last week? You missed a neck problem. Have you dealt with low back pain in the last week? You missed a neck problem. Have you dealt with somebody that has anterior knee pain at certain times when they're running? You probably missed a neck problem. Because the neck, head control, and this is why head control, we talked about breathing as being important because it starts the process. Controlling the head is so important. It's the second part of our process of developing control, because the neck is the only region of the body where every single fascial line interacts and crosses. So what's going on at the neck literally affects every other part of the body. And if we have a neck problem, we're going to see ripples into other areas of the body. Because remember, the whole purpose of the muscles of the neck is to maintain our ability to get sensory input, maintain a level horizon, keep our head, keep our eyes, keep our ears pointed in the right direction, maintain our balance so that we don't face plant. When we start to lose any of that, when we start to lose neck range of motion, when we start to have neck pains, when we start to have neck stiffness, what do you think that does into how we develop outcomes, responses to maintain a level horizon, maintain our head pointed in the right direction, maintain our ears pointed in the right direction? We have to find workarounds. So when that athlete comes in and they have a stiff neck because they slept on the bus wrong, or they slept with their head in this weird position on the way to the game, That's very critical to get that taken care of. Because now if my neck's all got a crick in it and I'm walking around like this, that's going to change the entire tone of all of our fascial lines. All right. So real quick, I said quiz just to get your all's attention. It's not really a quiz because I'm not going to grade it. What are all the motions of the neck? You have to list out all the motions of the neck. What are they? You can write them down. You can say them, either one. I'm going to ask you to say them anyway. So, what do we got from neck motions? Flexion, extension. Lateral flexion to the left, lateral flexion to the right. Got our rotations. Is that it? What do you call it? What's the other one then? I've never heard the term. You're correct. Protraction, retraction is how I learned it. So protraction, forward, retraction. I just never heard it as capital flexion because it maybe was a capital extension. I don't know. Capital flexion, capital extension. We just created a new term, or protraction, retraction. This motion here, yes. That one often gets forgotten. And from a postural standpoint, from a cervical alignment, cervical retraction is one of the easiest places to start and one of the more important ones to start with. Just because if we try to, everybody stick your head way forward and now try to extend your neck as far as, try to extend your head as far as you, yeah, it's kind of hard to do, right? You can't get a lot of extension with your head way forward. Now retract your spine, cervical spine, and try to look up. A little bit more motion, freedom of motion with that. So a lot, and why that's important, we're living in a time now with technology where we spend a lot of time here, our heads down, looking at a screen or whatever. And we always hear about how cervical extension, cervical flexion is causing all these problems, cervical flexion is causing all these problems, that's fine. But we can flex our spine and keep our head relatively over our trunk. Where we run into problems is when our head gets way out in front of us. And when that happens, it's a combination of flexion and protraction. And so just like it's hard for you guys to protract your head or neck and extend your spine, it's also hard to retract your spine and flex your neck. So we have to understand that when we're talking about cervical extension, protraction is important, the ability to draw the head back. When we're talking about retraction and extension, protraction, flexion go together. So we have to understand that protraction and retraction is hidden in there and often gets overlooked. We want to jump straight to flexion, straight to extension, straight to lateral flexion, straight to the rotation. So don't forget the protraction and retraction of the neck, especially when we're talking about flexion or extension-based problems of the neck. All right, so now we're going to go back to some basic athletic training skills. Palpation. So for this one, we don't have any tables. You don't need tables. We're actually going to not lay down, but you're going to lay your head on the table. We're going to have you partner up. And what I want you guys to do, I want you to partner up and I want you to palpate C1. And then once you think you've palpated C1, I want you to show me where you've palpated C1. And I'm going to tell you guys whether you actually palpated C1 or whether or not you aren't quite palpating C1. Okay, so partner up. Person one is just going to, you guys, this may be way after your time, but when I was in grade school, we used to play this game called Heads Up, 7 Up. Okay, so it's like that, only we're not playing Heads Up, 7 Up. So you're just going to rest your head on the ground, head on the table. Other person's going to palpate. I want you guys to try and palpate C1. Once you think you've got it, let me know. All right, show me where you guys are palpating. You guys are all palpating exactly where I thought you would. Unfortunately, none of you palpated C1. Now, part of it is you can't palpate, and here's why. This comes back. You guys were all, how did I know you guys were all going to palpate in the exact same place? Because that's what you were taught. Because that's how we teach it. And this is where textbook and practicality aren't necessarily meshed together. Where you guys all palpated is where C1 is. If you feel something there, that's going to be a problem. Because C1, look at how little bitty tiny that little spinous process is. Didn't really have one. That's really hard to palpate. And if I had, now, were you all in the right area? Yeah, everybody's palpating in the area. And here's where this is important. For a majority of what we do, that's fine. There's two times where it's not fine. If somebody's down on the field and you're palpating, am I on C1, am I on C2, am I on C3? If they have neck issues, kind of important to know exactly where you're at. Now, the frequency in which that happens, relatively low. The seriousness, relatively high. But it doesn't happen that often. From a manual standpoint, extremely important. From a dry needling standpoint, even more important. Risk is still relatively low because there's not a lot of other stuff you can hit in here. But if I'm trying to get into the suboccipitals, I need to make sure I'm in the suboccipitals. So where you guys all palpated is where the spinous process of C1 is supposed to be. It's just, it's not there. So when you palpate, it's kind of hard because you don't really feel anything, but that's kind of the right area, right? But I don't feel anything. If you feel something there, we have a problem. But there is a way to actually palpate C1 where you know that you're exactly on C1, because when you're feeling, it's not one of those where I think I'm in the right area, but let's hope it's, that's it. You guys want to know where that's at? Okay, partner back up, go back to where you were. We're going to start from a place that we all know. You're going to start from that little bony protuberance behind the ear where the sternocleidomastoid is attached to. I don't remember the name of it. Mastoid, that's what it was. That was a tough one, mastoid process. So you're going to palpate the mastoid process. Everybody find that? Have them move their head a little bit, and you probably don't feel a whole lot, right? Because if you're on the mastoid, there's not a lot of movement. You'll feel the sternocleidomastoid, but that's about it. Now what you're going to do, you're going to go down just barely about a half a thumb's width, and you're going to come posterior just a little bit. And you're going to be on the transverse process of C1. So an easy way you can do this, if you can palpate where their SCM is, it's going to be just behind that SCM. You're trying to catch it right there, just behind that sternocleidomastoid. Here's the mastoid process. You're coming down to right here. So basically, if you start on the mastoid process, you're just going to palpate to the back of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And that first little bony thing that you run into is C2. It's the transverse process of C1. So when we palpate it, it's way out here. Look at how wide that is. I can't see it, but it feels like it's about that wide. Now, given we're not right on it because there's muscle in between, but that's how wide the transverse processes are for C1, right behind the SCM. Okay? Why is that important? Because we start to catch the suboccipitals right there. Okay? So now go ahead, flip it over from a partner standpoint, let the other person palpate C1, see if they can find it. The important thing here is you want to make sure you're just posterior to the sternocleidomastoid. If you're on it, you're not going to feel this. You're not going to be able to palpate this. Now, how many of you guys were a little tender there? So another thing, you guys go ahead and sit. Well, we'll do the next one real quick. We'll come back to this. So now what I want you to do, palpate C2. Okay? palpate C2. Now the thing with C2, we actually do start to have a spinous process with this. The easiest way to palpate C2 is exactly how you guys went the first time, where you started the occipital protuberance and you go down. The first bony thing you run into in midline is going to be the spinous process of C2. So that's the easiest way to get into that one. You can still palpate the transverse processes. It's just a little bit tougher in some people, just because now is that C1, is that C2, it's a little bit harder, takes a little bit more practice to get to that. But the easiest way is if you start in the midline and go inferior, that first bony protuberance you're going to run into is C2. So go ahead and flip that one around, palpate C2 on the other person, and then we'll come back and talk about this. No, it doesn't. Why?
You gotta find that. You just find
It's busy.
goes in the middle.
So you get like an hour break or is there practice?
No, that's a break. But I'll probably have somebody sign up.
So C1 sits up nice and high. You're going to palpate it laterally. C2 sits down nice and low. That's that first bony protuberance you can run into. Why this is important? You guys did find some tenderness and some stuff in there? Anytime there's any kind of eye strain, and again, in our world now, where we spend so much time looking at phone screens, computer screens, focusing on things right in front of us, we all the time are hearing about how important it is to, look away from the screen, let your eyes adjust, look at something out beyond. I literally talked about that not too long ago. When we start to have eye strain, because of the connection and the how close the suboccipitals are into our visual system, we'll also run into some cervical issues with that, some cervical tenderness, because those muscles they're completely tied into what the eyes are doing. They're going to also bear some of that burden. If we have any kind of flexion-based problems, we'll talk about this again in part 3 with the superficial backline. There's oftentimes something going on tied into this area. We had a grad student in our first year program. This is back when you guys had to do a thesis. And her thesis project was looking at the suboccipitals and whether or not a suboccipital release actually improved toe touch and active straight leg raise. I don't think it was active straight leg raise. I think it was just toe touch. And so what she would do, you'd come in and see how far down you could touch. She'd put you on the table. She would do 5 minutes of manual work into the suboccipitals. And then she would stand you back up, and toe touch remarkably got significantly better in everybody, just by addressing those suboccipitals. So think about how many times we're going after a hip flexion problem. How many times do you guys stretch out hamstrings in a day? How many people do we run into that have tight hamstrings? Well, how often is that hamstring tightness in the superficial backline because of the tone that the suboccipitals are setting? And I'll answer that, that's relatively high. You take down the tone in the suboccipital area, and that's going to change the tone of the entire superficial backline. So if you have somebody and you're looking at them, they do a straight leg raise and it looks like this, or their toe touch looks like this, you can go after and you can stretch the hamstrings. You can get wild and crazy and stretch the hip flexors. But if you really want to make a change, you can go after the suboccipitals. And how we go after the suboccipitals is we go after those two areas, the transverse process of C1, get into that area, and just above and lateral to the spinous process of C2. And we can get in and actually affect those suboccipitals. One, two. Now, I will say when we start talking about getting into this area, there's a lot of musculature that you have to work through with that. It's not very challenging. It just takes a little bit of practice, but if you can kind of catch those areas again, you can make significant change in what's going on at the hip, at the knee, at these other areas. Somebody has a headache, especially a headache from looking at any kind of screen. This area can be a game changer for them because you take down the tone in this area because, again, that connection between the visual system and the suboccipitals, we decrease the tone of the suboccipitals, we can minimize it, we can have a positive effect on that individual's having that headache. All right, so from a head control standpoint, step one, when we're talking head control, first we have to learn to control the head so we don't have that floppy head. So the first thing that we learn to do is to prevent movement. Which again, from a rehab standpoint, I'm going to ask the question, you guys haven't seen anybody working on the neck here recently. When it comes to cervical problems, usually what's the first thing that we go after and try to do? We stretch the neck and then we work on flexion and extension and lateral flexion and rotation. We work on increasing the mobility and then we work on creating the movement through our active ranges of motion. That's not how the neck learns to be a neck. So the first thing that the neck learns to do, the first way in which the neck learns to be a neck, the first way in which all of the muscles at and around the neck learn to be the muscles at and around the neck, first thing they do is they learn to keep the head still so that we don't have a head that's flopping around. Again, from an infant standpoint, that's why in very young infants, you have to actually put your hand underneath their head and support their head because they have no head control. You grab them by the body, the head stays wherever it's at, they got a big old floppy head, and that literally they have a big old floppy head. Could create some problems, so we have to support the head when we move them around because they haven't developed head control. So first thing we learn is to prevent movement. In supine, we're learning how to prevent extension and how to prevent retraction. So we're learning to keep the head from going backwards. In prone, we're learning how to prevent flexion and we're learning how to prevent protraction. So baby's laying on the belly, we lift the body up, the head's going to want to go into flexion. We're learning how to prevent flexion, prevent protraction. Sideline is not a posture, but it is halfway in between prone and supine. We learn how to prevent lateral extension. Lateral flexion, sorry, not lateral extension. I guess it's lateral extension on the other side. And then in our vertical postures, we learn how to integrate that control and that ability to maintain our head position on a vertical trunk and as we're moving through the environment. So step one is learning to not allow movement to take place. We teach the head how to maintain its position. Step two then is to actually create the movement. Use those muscles to actually then create flexion. Now when we look at this, when we talk about preventing movement in supine, we're preventing extension and retraction. When we move to stage two, if we're in supine, now we're actually creating protraction and cervical flexion. We actually are overcoming gravity. So step one, we're resisting gravity, preventing gravity from doing the thing that gravity is trying to do, which is push the head down to the ground. In step two, we actually have created enough force to where we can actually overcome gravity and create movement. Again, the problem we run into, and one of the reasons why dealing with the neck is oftentimes so frustrating for clinicians, is we don't know what we're doing. It's a process problem. It's an understanding problem. We go straight into let's move the neck. That's not how the neck learns to be a neck. We learn how to resist movement first. Then we learn to create movement. And the sheer process of resisting movement, remember, these muscles have to be fast. They have to know when to turn on and when to turn off. When we move the body, when we move the head, the muscles of the neck are having to constantly react and respond to that very quickly. If all we teach them to do is to concentrically and eccentrically produce movement, that's not training them for the thing that they're trying to do, which is control the head. This is all, I mean, this is literally head control. We're talking about head control, not cervical range of motion. It's all about controlling the head. Everybody go ahead, stand up real quick. Everybody face me, but now turn your head so that your nose and your eyes are pointed at the exit side. Okay? Now, your head and your nose are going to stay pointed at the exit side. I want you to adjust the rest of your body so you're lined up, your sternum's pointed right at that. And then I want you to go as far to your right as you can. So move your trunk and your body as far to the right as you can, but you can't move your head. And just adjust as far as you can go. And then I want you to go as far to the left as you can. So once you get there, go all the way around. You're like, okay, what's the big deal? You guys can go ahead and sit down. Let me ask you this question though. As you were doing that, how many of you guys are thinking about the muscles that needed to keep your head pointed that way versus the muscles that you had to use to actually move your feet? You were thinking about this, right? You're thinking about this. This just happens. That's how those control muscles need to work. They need to, we're not focused on where the head has to be. That's innate. That just happens below the level of consciousness. And it has to be like that. We don't, if you guys would have been thinking about what's going on with your head, then you trip over your bag. You get your foot hung up on the stool. You get your feet tied up and all that, and you fall over. We don't need our attention to be here. This just needs to happen. Our attention needs to be on how we're interacting with the world around us, where our feet are being pointed, where our feet are touching. Oh, my foot just hit the outside of the bag. I need to adjust my foot. When you guys are moving around, if your foot hit the table or hit the stool or hit the bottom of your chair or hit your bag, how many of you guys had to look down? Or did you like, oh, it's there, I'm just going to adjust around it? More often than not, if we have an idea of what's going on with our surroundings, if we hit something, we just adjust our foot. We don't even have to readjust our head because this is just happening. So when we talk about head control, it just needs to happen. One of the problems, again, is when it comes to cervical stuff, ask other clinicians that you're working with, ask other athletic trainers that you're working with, hey, if somebody has neck problems, what do we typically do? What's your approach to addressing neck issues? How do you go about that? And the answer you're going to get is likely we're going to do some soft tissue stuff. We might work on increasing range of motion, and then we're going to work on active range of motion. What step did we just skip? The actual most important one of preventing movement, of controlling the head. When we're walking, again, when we're walking, our head is up and around and looking at things. We're not constantly flexing and rotating or anything with our head. Now, if we hear a car honk and we're walking next to the road, we might turn our head to see what's going on and reorient our eyes and our ears. But we're maintaining a level head. Watch somebody run and watch how still their head is. Heck, if you go to a track event, if you watch the sprinters, watch those people that finish well, meaning they finish the top part of their heat, versus those that come in at the back part of their heat, and watch their head. You'll see a very high correlation. Those that finish well and run well and have good technique, head doesn't move a whole lot. They're very efficient. Those people that don't run very well, they aren't very efficient, like the kid I was telling you about, you're going to see a lot more head movement. They're not as efficient. So head control is all about timing. We have to start by controlling movement, not creating movement. Now, there is a time and there is a place for cervical range of motion. If somebody's missing cervical movement, Yeah, we might have to stretch things out. We might also have to get in and do some manual therapy to release some tension in there. But when it actually comes to the exercise-based interventions, we need to start controlling movement. One of the big debates in the lifting world comes with the deadlift. Do we keep a neutral spine, a neutral cervical spine when we're deadlifting, or do we allow the head and the neck to move while we're deadlifting? And you'll find people that are very emotionally attached to each one of those. And I think it's a complete and utter waste of time and energy because we don't know enough. Because my next question is, well, why are we deadlifting? When might it be important for my head to move around? If we're having somebody deadlift, when might it be important for my head to move? Why is it important for my head to move around? So real quick, everybody stand up. Everybody can face me. All I want you to do, give yourselves a little bit of space. So you're going to take one hand, and I just want you to, whatever this position is, whatever this distance is, I want you to keep your chin in contact with your index finger the whole time. So we don't want any cervical movement. And then all I want you to do is to go from here to resting your other elbow on your knee. Okay? I just want you to go back and forth. But now, this motion has to stay the same. Okay? So now for it also to be a deadlift, your trunk has to be horizontal, which means your eyes are going to be on the ground at the bottom. Okay? So now everybody go into the bottom of that deadlift position with your eyes pointing at the ground. Everybody get down there and hang out there for a second. Don't move your head. Now how many fingers am I holding up? Okay, now how many fingers am I holding up?
4. Am I getting it right?
You got it right the first time. I was like, I didn't even see your eyes. Wow. You guys can sit down. So now, when we keep our head still, when we control the head, you see this spot, right? You see the floor in front of you. It's hard for you to see the world around you. So you're getting sensory input, visual input about this area right here. That's wonderful. If I'm in a powerlifting competition or I'm on a deadlift platform and that's what I need to do, then that's wonderful. Keep your head still, keep the neck neutral, deadlift just like that. But what if I'm training an athlete? Saturday in football, I want you to watch the linebackers. I want you to watch the linebackers right before the ball snaps. They'll be down in a position similar to this. How far down they are, they'll be in a relatively athletic position. Hands might be on their knees, hands might be free in space, but they're going to be here. I want you to look at where their head is. Are they like this? Or are they like this? And if they're like this, you probably won't see them in the game very long. Because they get down in this position, their head's up, and they're looking around and they're moving their head around. Why? Why are they looking around and moving their head around before the ball snapped? What do I need? If I'm playing defense, what do I need to know? What's the most important thing for me to know before the ball snapped? What the offense is doing. If I'm responsible for him and he's here, I need to be able to see this. Well, if he shifts that way and my head's right here and I don't see him, I just get myself pulled out of the game. So I need to be in this position, ready to move in athletic position, but then I also need my head to be up and moving around so I can get the visual information to know about what's going to happen. So from a training standpoint, if we're doing deadlifting to improve somebody's sports performance, somebody's athletic performance, we need to make sure that they can get into this position with cervical extension and keep their eyes up because they need to get that sensory input. If I'm training somebody to be an Olympic lifter or a power lifter, I just need to live in this 3-foot world. We don't need to have that conversation. So we need to first learn to control the head. Then, when it's appropriate, we need to learn when to move the head because it's all about controlling the head and getting sensory information in. And we need to be able to effectively do both at the exact right time. We'll spend more time talking about this when we get to the fascial line section of class, but the neck is the one area of the body where every fascial line actually crosses that area. Can't say the same thing about the low back. We can't say the same thing about the shoulder. We can't say the same thing about the ankle. The only place in which every fascial line crosses is the neck. Which means that head control is integrated with every shape. Head control is integrated with any type of movement that we're going to try and do or pull off, whether it's from an athletic standpoint or just normal everyday activity. When we look at it, how many of the 30 muscles across that neck do you guys think you can name? 4, 5, to be honest. When I was typing these out, I'm like, I've never heard of this muscle before. Better make sure I spell it right. But there's 30 muscles across the neck on each side. So 30 muscles on the left side, 30 muscles on the right side. You got a lot going on. Whole point of that, it's a very complex area. None of them are very large. All of them are very small. They're at multiple different levels. If I ask, when we're talking about the hip, which is the, our strongest hip extensor, that's an easy question. It's the glute max. It's the biggest muscle in the hip area. What's the strongest cervical extensor? When we look at it from a muscle standpoint, there's really not the one muscle that stands out. Why is that? What's the strongest elbow flexor? The biceps. And if you spend enough time working on the biceps, what happens? It gets ginormous, right? Has anybody ever seen somebody walking around with a neck that has this giant like biceps bulge on it? No, because again, what's the function of the neck? It's all about control. It's all about maintaining the head where it needs to maintain. It's all about moving quickly. Now, when I say moving quickly, it's not about moving our head quickly. It's about being able to move and orient the body quickly and at the right time. Just like when you guys were looking at the exit sign. You weren't moving your head fast. You were maintaining your head alignment at the sign, but everything else in your body was having to adjust and rotate with that while maintaining that orientation. So those muscles of the neck had to move quickly. They had to adjust quickly. So when we look at this, there's not a giant muscle that controls the neck. They're all very small, all have very subtle names. The deeper you go, the more unknown they are. When we talk about, if we wanted to talk about the largest muscles of the neck, we'd be talking about the upper trap, we'd be talking about the platysmus on the front, the sternocleidomastoid on the side. Those are the biggest neck muscles that we have. Those are the strongest neck muscles that we have. You will see people that have very pronounced upper trap areas. You'll have people that you see that have very thick necks in certain sports. You don't see it a lot in some sports, but in certain sports you will see some hypertrophy of the neck because of the nature of the sport. You see it's not uncommon to see it in football. They have a giant helmet on top of their head. You see it in a lot of the grappling combat sports, and you see it a lot of the striking combat sports. You see it in the striking combat sports, not necessarily because of the training that they're doing, but because if you get hit, that's again, talking about muscle force, muscular responsibility, it's all about dissipating the forces. So you see them have rather well-developed necks to help dissipate those forces. Those are the main ones where we actually see hypertrophy of the neck. When we start going a little bit deeper, until this moment in time, if I asked you guys where the splenius capitis muscle is, would you have known? Maybe by the name, it's splenius and capitis. It's something that attaches to the head, so maybe in the neck area. You can get that from the title. But we're starting to talk about muscles that we don't really, didn't know they were neck muscles. You probably wouldn't, oh, hey, look at that. We do have the levator scapula. That's one of the more well-known muscles of the neck. It attaches to the scapula and it levates the scapula. It's in the name, elevates the scapula. And then when we look at these, hey, real quick, go ahead, palpate the splenius coli muscle. Yeah, it's in this region, right there. Again, we might be able to get the name of it. We might be able to guess the area based off of the name, but we're talking very small. I mean, look how little these muscles are. They're little muscles. They're long muscles. A lot of the muscles go. Is it this one? Yeah, this is the last one. Some of these go from spinous process to spinous process, transverse process to transverse process. They're not big, strong muscles. Again, the only big, strong muscles, upper trap, latissimus, sternocleidomastoid. The deeper we go, the smaller they get. Here's a hint. The smaller a muscle is, the more its function is all about control. The closer to the axis of rotation a muscle is, the more its function is about control. So when we look at all of these little tiny muscles, and don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz over them. When we look at all these little tiny muscles of the neck at the deepest layer, their entire job is to control the neck. Here are all 30. There's a lot. My favorite is the posterior interosserii coli. Sounds like something you get in a bad bag of salad, but you know. Rectus posterior major. We might confuse that one for the rectus femoris. I don't know, maybe because of the rectus. But anyway, there's a lot of muscles, and again, majority of the neck muscles are very small, very long muscles whose function is all about control, not creating movement. All right, any questions about head control? I'll be honest, from a rehab standpoint, right now, breathing is the new prom queen. Everybody's talking about breathing and how to integrate breathing, and I think that's extremely appropriate. The wheelhouse of rehab has been some of the later stages, the weight shifting, the perturbations, the dissociation. We've been nailing that for a long time. Head control and pushing down are the two areas that we know the least amount about. Those are the two areas that we actually integrate into our therapies the least, but those are also the two areas that are probably the most influential on the outcomes of our patients. Because head control, like I said, because of the neck's interaction with all of the fascial lines, what the head does influences everything else. And also, again, if you have somebody that has any kind of shoulder issue, you have a neck issue. I 100% of the time, just because of if you have some. And when I say that, I don't mean somebody tore their labrum and they have a neck problem, not because of the direct structural issues. Somebody has shoulder surgery. What's the one commonality after every shoulder surgery? Why do they get tight traps? Because after every shoulder surgery, you get a sling. And there's not a sling on the planet that prevents you from doing this. Well, and then also, too, if something hurts, the tendency is to have a flexor type withdrawal from it. And when we have that, we draw this space up. What do you think is happening to all of these muscles that need to turn on and turn off really quickly? They turn on and they stay on. If we turn the lights on and we leave them on when class is over and they stay on all night, compared to you turn them on when classes are going, they turn off when class is out, we turn them off at night, which light's going to burn out quicker? The one that's on 24/7 or the one that's turning on and turning off when it needs to? The one that turns on all the time is one we're going to have problems. Which one is going to have an increase in waste product buildup? The one that's constantly firing and not pumping and it's got a tetanic contraction, or the one that's actually turning on and turning off? So when we get stuck here, nothing good happens. It becomes very painful. And it becomes painful because of the buildup of the metabolic waste products because it's always on. So if you have a shoulder patient, they're going to be in a sling. If they're in a sling, they're guaranteed to have some of this going on. Even if it's just subconsciously, because my shoulder hurts, I want to do this. So you have that patient, one of the best things you can do for them, the thing that they'll appreciate the most, is actually spending time working on their neck, creating space here. And I promise you, if you spend time doing that, all of a sudden, whatever shoulder symptoms they were having is going to significantly improve without you ever touching the shoulder. Just because, well, then also let's think about it. There's a lot going on here. When you have a neck issue, you have a neck issue. You know, have any of you guys woken up with a crick in your neck in the morning? How much does it affect the rest of your day? You can't get that off of your mind. It's always there. You're in the car, you go to turn your head, oh crap, my neck hurts. Put on my jacket, oh, my neck hurts. It's literally right. I mean, think about where our sensory organs are and how this feels. We're very acutely aware of this. If you have an ingrown toenail, when does it bother you? When you step on it or when somebody stubs your foot. It's not one of those you're walking, you're like, oh, my toenail hurts. Or when you turn your head in the car, oh, my toenail hurts. It's only when you hit it. But when you have a neck issue, you have a neck issue. And it's right there in the forefront of what's going on. Very similar to a headache. So we can do a lot for our patients. Any upper body issues where there's any kind of a mobilization or a sling, we address the neck, we can create lots of improvement for that patient. Questions about head control? All right, pushing down. Just like the last two sections, write down everything you know about pushing down. It's part of the neurodevelopmental sequence. We push down into the ground. That's about it. I told you guys I would give you a point, 100 points for every bullet point you wrote. Would anybody be getting more than like 300 bonus points for their class? We don't know a lot about this one. That's fine. That's why we're here to talk about it. We don't know a lot about this one because prior to when we started talking about pushing down, had that been anything that you guys had talked about in any of your previous rehab courses? No. It's almost like I knew that. And just like I said just a second ago, head control and pushing down are the two areas that we know the least amount about from a rehab standpoint. They're the two areas that we typically integrate the least into rehab. They're also the two areas that if you get good at those two areas, will have significant impacts on anything that you're trying to address. Pushing down is completely based off of Newton's third law. You guys remember that one? For every action, there's equal and opposite reaction. Pushing down is all about pushing down into the ground to get up away from. You're not going to see any movement with this. And this is one of the reasons why we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about it. Because if we asked people to, if we gave people this list, breathing, head control, pushing down, weight shifting, perturbations, and dissociations, and we said out of these six patterns, there's really only 5. Which one doesn't belong? We're going to get rid of pushing down every single time because we don't see it. You can't see pushing down because as soon as you start to see movement, what you're seeing is the weight shift. We see the weight shift. We don't see the pushing down. The pushing down is something that you have to feel. And that's one of the reasons why, because we don't see it. We see the active straight leg raise, we see the lifting of whatever, we see the dissociation, we see the cervical range of motion, we see the big distension of the belly when you diaphragmatically breathe. We don't see the pushing down. Since we don't see it, it doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. But again, pushing down and head control, those two areas have the most impact on everything else we're going to talk about moving forward. It's all about getting that equal and opposite reaction. The harder you push down into the ground, the more ground reaction forces you're going to get. Your body's response to that is what ends up being movement. But we have to, in order to get that response, we have to get that initial push down into the ground. And oftentimes that's what we don't get. So what pushing down does, pushing down, it develops a strength control needed for our tissues to be able to withstand the pressure of our own body. Pushing down leads to tissue tolerance, an increase in tissue tolerance, and an increase in tissue adaptation. How many of you guys in the room run on a regular basis? You guys get out of class. I hate running. If I said, okay, starting tomorrow, class is going to, we normally start class at 8. From now on, for the rest of the semester, we're going to start class at 8:45, and I'm going to wrap up at 9:15. I'm only going to talk for 30 minutes. But for the first 45 minutes, we're going to go over to the track, and you just have to run. And if you don't run, it's 45 minutes. If you don't get a solid 4 miles in, you get an F in the class. And we're going to do that every day. What would happen if we went from 0 to running 4 miles a day? In our, what was that? We haven't got to the drop day yet. It wouldn't feel good, right? I don't know where it would hurt, but it's not going to feel good somewhere. Some of us, it might be in our feet. Some of us might have knee pain. Some of us, it might be our hips, our low back. Some of us might have neck issues. Where you get it, I don't know. But here's the nice thing. Where you feel it, that's the weakest link in your chain. Because what it comes down to, it's not that running's the problem. Running 4 miles, there's people that don't even call that a warm-up. There's people that call that like my monthly mileage. But running 4 miles isn't the problem. The problem is we went from 0 to 4 miles. We didn't gradually build up tissue tolerance. And we went, basically in that instance, we went from supine to standing and a lot of standing. The benefit of the neural developmental sequence, why it happens the way it does, why when there's enough we move up, is because one of the things that's also developing with this is tissue tolerance. The tissue tolerance to stress. We gradually and progressively increase forces, expose the body, expose the tissues to forces so that that tissue can build up a gradual and progressive tolerance to it. Running 4 miles isn't a problem unless you go from running 0 miles today to 4 miles tomorrow and you keep doing that. If I said though starting in August, we're going to start out running a quarter mile before class. We're going to go out and we're just going to jog a lap. Nice easy pace. And we're going to do that for a week. And then each week we're going to add a quarter mile to that. Early on in the week, when we go that first 2 or 3 times we do a quarter mile, we might be a little bit sore and fatigued, but by the end of the week, we're like, okay, it's not bad. And then when we go up to a half a mile, first couple times, we might be a little bit sore and fatigued afterwards, but by the end of the week, it's going to be fine. And we'll progressively build that up because we're progressively building up tissue tolerance. We're progressively building up the tolerance to that. So that when we get to 4 miles, the 4 miles that had we gone from 0 to 4 miles would have wrecked everybody in the class. The 4 miles is a bit uncomfortable the first couple times, but it's not that big of a deal. We just have to progressively get there. We think about it from we need to build up our cardiovascular system. Well, your cardiovascular system could go run 4 miles today. Your tissues couldn't. You might feel like your lungs are about to jump out of your body, and you might want to throw your lungs out of your body, but if you were to force through it and run the 4 miles, your cardiovascular system can handle that. The soft tissue in the rest of your body is not going to be able to. So the nice thing that the neurodevelopmental sequence teaches us about tissue tolerance and tissue adaptation, is it's a gradual process. We need to progressively increase our ability to introduce forces to the body, to the tissues. If we don't, we're going to run into problems 100% of the time. And from a rehab standpoint, one of the things that we run into is we spend time exposing the body to too little forces, so we don't see the adaptation, or we jump straight ahead into too much force and we run into problems. We don't understand why we're running into these issues. It's a force mitigation issue. I think it's important for us to understand, especially when it comes to the neurodevelopmental sequence, is our tissues are constantly adapting to every movement and every position that we're exposing them to. How you're sitting right now, your body is adapting to that. Your tissues are constantly adapting. That's one of the nice things about the human body, is because unless there's an actual structural problem, we can fix anything. Even with some of the structural problems, we have people that have skill sets that can fix that. There are orthopedic surgeons. You tear your ACL, they reconstruct your ACL. We can fix that. You have the inevitable rounded shoulders, forward head. Structurally, all the muscles are there. We have no structural damage. We can fix that. Why do we see the shoulders round and the head go forward? Gravity's pulling us that way. The tissues adapt to that. Certain tissues get long, certain tissues get stretched out. Our body is adapting to that. We can overcome that. So the nice thing is, unless we're talking about an actual structural situation where there's damaged structure, there's structures that have been that have undergone trauma or injury, we can reverse almost everything. Unfortunately, that's one of the problems, because the fact that every tissue is so adaptable and it's adapting to everything that we expose it to, that's what leads us to a situation where we have the forward shoulders and the forward head and the rounded shoulders. How do we develop forward shoulders and forward head and rounded shoulders? Because we spent time here. When you show me somebody's posture, when you look at somebody's posture, when you look at how somebody walks, when you look at how somebody stands, when you look at how somebody gets from point A to point B, they're showing you a picture of what they've exposed their systems to. When you see somebody that walks with their feet out like this, that tells us a lot about that person's system. What does that tell us? It tells us that they spend a lot of time with their feet in external rotation. What's the biggest problem with walking with your feet in external rotation? What was that?
Like your weight's not distributed.
Weight's not distributed appropriately. What kind of joint is the knee? Is it what motion is the knee capable of? Flexion extension. We might be able to get a little bit of tibial rotation, but really the knee is primarily a flexion extension joint. Well, if I'm walking with my feet externally rotated, I'm going to go where my feet are pointed. Every step is literally a battle between my body wanting to go this way and my body wanting to go this way. My knee is designed to flex like this. The problem is I'm going this way. So the only way that my knee can flex going this way is to go into a valgus collapse and whip around and then kick my foot back out to the side. So the knees are designed to flex and extend straight ahead. When we walk with our feet turned out, they go this way, or they're supposed to. But how many of us walk like this? We don't. What we end up doing is we get this nice little heel whip and we get all kinds of things that happen. And we go through these great gait training drills to work on all of this stuff, and then we let the person leave, and the most important thing that we could have done for this person, we didn't do. And what do you think that is? If I'm spending all my time like this, and I'm trying to fix it and get them back here because they have knee pain and they don't know why their knee hurts, what's the most important thing for me as a clinician to do with that patient? Hey, keep your feet pointed straight ahead. When you find yourself standing up, look down at your feet. You've got to have a little bit of self-awareness because your tissues are going to realign to this. And if you're spending 23 hours, if you're spending the 8 hours a day you're up on your feet with your feet pointed like this, we're going to run into problems. You're going to have medial knee pain because and how often do the people that have their feet like this complain of either anterior knee pain or medial knee pain? Oftentimes it's medial knee pain. Well, what tissue do I have to elongate to allow my knee to hinge in this plane? The MCL. What do you think happens to the MCL when you stretch it out? It doesn't feel good. It's called an MCL sprain. But it has to create the ability to elongate if I'm constantly exposing it to this stress. Well, how do we fix that? It's a very complex situation. Point your feet forward. When you walk, be very conscious and aware. It's going to feel weird. Walking with your feet forward. When you're standing, stand with your feet forward. Because at some point, people have to understand that your body is your body. You can come see us as clinicians and as athletic trainers, and we can do rehab on you for an hour, but the other 23 hours of the day and the entire next day, it's your body, and you're going to have to maintain it. And your tissues are going to adapt exactly to the forces that we have exposed them to. Soft tissue work, the easiest way to think about tissue work is it's like you're training a dog. If you have a dog that runs wild, if your neighbor has a dog that barks, it's always running around, what's the problem? The dog or the owner? It's the owner. Because you have a dog that's undisciplined. The dog is going to do and learn exactly what the owner exposes it to. If you have a very well-behaved dog, a very obedient dog, that dog has been exposed to an owner that has trained the dog and done all this other stuff. Tissues are the exact same way. They're going to adapt and respond to everything that we expose them to. If you have low back pain, you have low back pain because you created low back pain. Nobody has a bad squat. Nobody has bad knees. Nobody has bad hips. Nobody was born with any of this stuff. Unless you were actually born with this and this has been a lifelong issue. But all of a sudden, when you're in your 30s, you don't have bad knees. You broke them. The knees you had were designed to last you 120 years, and however you used them, you burned through them in 30 years. That's a you problem. And it's because of the stresses that you've been exposing those joints to. So we have to understand that from a tissue standpoint, everything we expose these tissues to, the body is going to adapt to. Both in a good way and also in a negative way. All right.